Until 15 years ago, Arlington Presbyterian was a destination church. I don't mean that in a good way. Arlington's high cost of living had driven a lot of church members into the suburbs, but they'd drive back on Sunday for services. Then they'd get back in their cars and drive home.
We were happily introverted as a congregation and happy to stay behind the closed red doors, as I say on the website. Back in the beginning, the church was actually a church plant. And so it was meant to be a community church, and over time, people moved away, kept coming back to the church, but it ended up being a destination. And so hardly anyone that was a member lived in the immediate vicinity.
Victoria and I spoke with Susan Robbins Etherton and John Etherton, long-standing church members, about how the church moved from being a destination church to a true community church.
And we would come in on Sundays, park in our parking lot, go inside the red doors, and church was over, and we would go back out to the car and home. And so we had no connection with the community and what was happening in the community.
Over a 12-year span from 2009 till after the COVID lockdown, the people of Arlington Presbyterian transformed their church and themselves. They got to know their Columbia Pike neighbors and what they most needed, which was affordable housing. They sold their building and their land on Columbia Pike to make way for a 173-unit affordable housing building. Then they decided to rent space and move their meetings into that new building called Gilliam Place. They're now friends and acquaintances with a lot of its residents, several who have special needs.
This episode tracks the church's transformation. It explores how a democratic process carried out in a covenant relationship can transform any people, religious or not, and create public spaces.
I'm Victoria Topin.
And I'm Bryce Tolpin. We'll start in the middle of the narrative just to introduce you to Ashley Goff. She became pastor of Arlington Presbyterian at a critical moment in this transformation. Gilliam Place was being constructed, and the church was renting space down the street. The church's vision for affordable housing was coming true, but should the church itself continue or disband? They decided to continue. They would buy back the rest of their land on the old block that the developer didn't need. They'd build a garden and a play area there for the community, and then rent back space in Gilliam Place to meet in. Ashley found this near-death experience by a flexible and faithful congregation a good match for what she had been going through.
In my interview process, they were very clear about their kind of vulnerable state. There was there was still a lot of grief in the congregation from just the move, just the whole project was, there was a lot of grief in that, a lot of loss. And I was coming, my congregation, I was leaving, there was a lot of grief and loss in that leave taking that I was part. So I was sad and they were sad, so I felt like our kind of melancholy mood kind of matched a little bit, but they had the foundation there that I wanted to step into. And there was all eyes were on Arlington to see if they could make it. And when I was interviewing, they were very clear about, well, we really had to think about what it meant to die as a congregation. And in my previous church, my colleague died, and pancreatic cancer. And I had to lead the congregation through this kind of really this death process, this grieving process. But what I was hearing from them was freedom from that, coming from that, from their own death experience of really getting curious about what would it mean to die as a congregation. They didn't want to die, but if they did, they would have left 173 homes on Columbia Pike through Gilliam Place. Right. So that sense of freedom coming from their own death story and what I was experiencing in my own grieving process, I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. I wanted to be part of that.
Right.
That real sense of they just owned the death. And
right. It was a very real possibility for them, and they didn't want to ignore it or,
No, everyone told them, you're going to die. This is the dumbest thing you've ever done. This is the dumbest thing any church has ever done. And they're like, well, this is the most faithful thing we've ever done. So, and I wanted to be in that space of, this kind of existential freedom space. I wanted to be in that.
This nadir of the process, this place of loss and grief and freedom, came almost 10 years after the process began. and 100 years after the church's founding. Susan and John take us there. How did all this get started?
In 2009, the session, which is the governing body for the local church for Arlington Pres, and the ministry team leaders, at the time we had ministry team leaders in session, so the spiritual leaders of the congregation had a retreat. We were doing some future visioning. We were invited to imagine the church in various ways. So the building, getting rid of the building and building affordable housing, came out of this futuring, dreaming session with the ministry team leaders in session. And so we all got very excited about that possibility in that group. And we decided to work through some of the details of it and present it as a possibility to the congregation in January at the annual meeting. And at the annual meeting, with our
I like John's face.
With our very well thought out plan, we thought it was very well thought out. We presented this, and they were horrified, and the congregation was just like, "Are you out of your minds?" And there was a very clear no, not a chance, not going to happen.
Instead of getting discouraged by their fellow congregants' negative reaction, the group developed a new democratic muscle. They began building relationships with the church's neighbors.
We were obviously disappointed, but what we recognized later was that we had not done our homework, and we didn't have a backstory. We'd had a visioning session, and so we heard a vision. We heard a call from God, but we didn't do the homework to say, and this is why. And so the vision team part of this that comes out a couple of years later, and there's stuff in between, came out of the desire to go out into the community, to do the work, the homework, the listening, listen for the stories of where our hearts were breaking for the community. And what we heard in that session, in those conversations, which we did in pairs, this was the parking lot conversations, we heard from people that they worked or lived there or used to live in the neighborhood but could no longer afford to. So they had moved further and further out into the suburbs. And they loved Arlington, but they could no longer afford to live there.
John described one strategy to get to know their neighbors, a barbecue food truck.
We had leased space in our parking lot for Sunday mornings. There was a barbecue business that was out, I think, at Stanton. And they wanted to come into Arlington and sell barbecue on Saturday morning. So we gave them lease or whatever for some nominal amount. And what we did was we set up a picnic table that was right next to the place where the truck was. And we got some popsicles and some sodas and whatever, and we just invited people that were there buying barbecue to come over and talk to us. And so we had a conversation over several Saturdays of, what do you think about the community? And then it wasn't just, people were coming from all over. They were coming from Washington, D.C. to get this barbecue because it was really good barbecue. But so we engaged a lot of people just in a very, relaxed setting about, what do you think about the area? What do you think it needs? What do you think? What should we be mindful of as we are walking around and trying to see things? What should we be looking at? That sort of thing.
With or without barbecue, meeting new neighbors developed a new muscle in the church.
It was a real eye-opener for me to go into the community and start walking down the streets and talking to people that we met. And the practice of having those kind of relational conversations was something that we had never done. And it was something that was really intentionally developed, probably more specifically once Ashley came on board to be doing those one-on-one relational conversations. What happened as a result of doing that, and to do the work, we had to exercise a muscle we didn't have and get to know how to do that. I was actually afraid to do it. I was like, I don't have any idea how. Surprisingly, I don't talk easily to strangers. I didn't want to. And over time recognized that was the way to get to know people. And it was not scary after all. It was a beautiful thing to be able to have a simple conversation with someone and talk to them about things that you love and get to know them. And so now, as a congregation, that is one of our, I would say that's one of our strengths.
Learning about community needs is now part of the church's DNA.
When we do our budget process every year, a integral part of that is going out into the community and talking to community leaders and just going out in the community and listening. How does this inform the type of priorities that we're going to put in the budget? And it does have a real impact. I mean, if we're aware of things that need to happen, or aware of potential partnerships, or aware of community needs that we might not otherwise be hearing about, that comes from being out. And Ashley models that. She's out. Her basic job description is to be out in the community 50% of her time, and she does it. She's out, and she lead, and so we all follow that lead.
Along with relationships, democratic practice involves transparency, flexibility, time, and trust.
I hear that you seem like you guys were two of the front runners as far as seeing the vision of wanting to go beyond just the brick and mortar building. But so how did you get from just the two of you to a portion of the people that wanted to move in that direction? What made the congregation, they were originally saying absolutely not, what brought them to yes, and we're doing it?
First of all, to put this in a little bit of a context, 2008 was our 100th anniversary. And I think that really started sort of a little bit more soul searching and reflection on where are we going from here. But to me, when we had the initial rejection of the whole idea, and it wasn't by everybody, but it was a pretty loud group, we sort of shifted to the idea of doing a New Beginnings assessment that would involve house meetings and a Bible study, appreciative inquiry about our history, an assessment of the demographics, like a more technical assessment, how we're using the building, the condition of the building. I mean, it was like a full-up kind of thing, and it culminated in a series of 6 weeks of different small group house meetings of everybody in the congregation. So at the end of that, everybody was asked individually to vote. What would you like to see as the future of this church? And there were choices from close, keep everything the same, do a completely redeveloped mission, do a parallel start where we would bring another group in and gradually fade away and let them have the assets, and all these different options. And the interesting thing was that of all of the choices, the one thing that didn't get a single vote was keep everything the same. Not one vote. We even had people that voted we should close the church, but they didn't vote for keep everything the same. And I think that process really brought everybody, whatever they thought about affordable housing and the building and all that, which was a separate issue, that we needed to go on a different course. We needed to move away from where we were. And I think that opened up people's thinking, and what came out of that was the vision team, where those of us who, a year later, when our pastor went on sabbatical, because she was gone, for that 3-month period, we decided to have this vision team process. And anybody could be on the vision team. It was open to anybody. But if you were on the vision team, there were certain things that you had to agree up front to do. One was daily Bible study. We had a daily prayer that we all said together at 9:37, which was, I think, Matthew 9:37, for, the harvest.
The laborers are few.
Laborers are few, and we would all pray that. We all agreed to set a little alarm on our watches or whatever to do that. And even more importantly, from my perspective, we agreed to go out by twos into the community and have at least 2 interviews with local people, either in the neighborhood or along Columbia Pike. But the most important...
A week. 2 a week.
2 a week. And the most important part of it, from my perspective, was that everybody agreed to report back to the group what they derived from the Bible study that week, what they derived from their visits, what they heard, and everybody had to feed that into it together. And then on Sunday morning, there would be one of us who would stand up in front of the congregation and would report back on what happened that week for us. So we could tell, so the congregation knew where we were going and what we were thinking. And then beyond that, we had a newsletter called Catching the Fire. And every week we would gather all this stuff up and put it out to the congregation in a newsletter. And that's what gradually, I think, the New Beginnings, this process, we really struggled to be as transparent as we could be in it. And at the end of the summer, we gathered everybody together and we said, here's what happened. Here's what we found. these are the directions that we think we need as a congregation.
Here are the stories. Here are the stories we heard from people.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's what and we still had many people, a good significant minority, who were not in favor of going in that direction, did not see the need for that kind of a transformation.
Expertise and experience also had a role, but the group made the experts accountable to the congregation through weekly Q&A sessions.
But the energy from the congregation around this, so affordable housing became clear, and we said that was one of the things that we felt called to pursue. But because we had now the backstories, we had done the work of being out in the community and listening, we had the why, then we could say, let's at least explore affordable housing. And we met a local housing developer, nonprofit, that agreed to, after a certain point in time, we did some more research, agreed to do a feasibility study with our property and see what was possible. And so then that began a very slow, detailed process of seeing if it was even possible to do affordable housing. And all along the way, so after the vision team, we presented our report to the congregation in January. And then we sort of closed the vision team and created an affordable housing team. And then the other parts had teams as well, but the affordable housing team took over the initiative of pursuing affordable housing. And we connected with the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing. And they agreed to do, the first thing they do is a pre-feasibility study, and that costs a lot less than a feasibility study. And once that looks like it pencils out, if you know anything about doing development, you have to do like the back of the envelope. So they did the pre-feasibility, and it looked very possible. And then from that, we got the approval to do the feasibility study. So they're all along the way, we were communicating what we had found, the decision points. At some point, we had to get the Presbyterian involved. And just bringing people along all along the way was one of the key things. Communicating, making sure this transparency was consistent. Anybody had any questions? And we had like open question sessions after church on Sundays, so people could ask, because they were still skeptical. One of the big questions that happened was pretty early on, was somebody said of the idea of affordable housing, well, who in the congregation knows anything about affordable housing? And I just kind of went, I do, because I actually had a career in multifamily development and affordable housing before I left the workforce. So I actually knew affordable housing intimately and from a developer perspective. And so I could talk the language, and I have been told and imagine that in that moment I was Esther. I was, for such a time as this, I was available to do this, to do this. And I actually quit this other group that I had been very actively involved in and said, this is what I'm supposed to be doing now. It was a God thing. I mean, all along the way, it was a God thing. We just were trying to pay attention to the signs. And at certain points where it was like, is this really of God? We had clarity, at very clear decision points, including the no's, right? The no's are important benchmarks of ways to turn and go a different direction.
So now you're on the other side of it. You know, you have, and it looks, it's just crazy that people even fought, because it's just like this amazing thing. So what do you think about what resulted from your walking by faith?
Number one, I wasn't sure we were going to get here. When we moved from the building over to the United Methodist Center, we were on Glebe Road, which is where we were during the construction period. We weren't even sure when we did that move where we were going after that. It had not been settled that we were going to go back into that building space. And we had dwindled. The numbers were small. Our pastor, Sharon Court, left shortly thereafter. She went on to her next calling. And so we were kind of a remnant in this little place. It was kind of run down, and I wasn't, when we were looking at 3 years before we were going to move to wherever our destination was. And I wasn't sure we were going to, be around in 3 years. And so, and that was fine with me. I mean, part of me felt if we ended up with the affordable housing, which is one of our missions, and we had the story and the experience, and wherever we ended up, we carried that with us. If that was the outcome, fine. And so we sort of worked our way through that process. When we were there, Ashley started with us.
They were doing the Bible study. They were doing the prayers. They were meeting with neighbors. Like, they were doing the practices of the faith that told them, like, you need to, you trust in this process.
I saw pictures from years ago. I saw pictures of people in suits and ties with the church in the background, and everything looked very Sunday morning-ish. And that was only, I think the pictures were like 15 years ago or something like that.
Yep.
So,
big change.
Yeah.
So a third of the congregation left.
Yeah.
That was another real huge loss. One of our worship services before moving into Gilliam Place, we had several that just kind of honored, the journey, and we talked about the cost of discipleship. Like, what was the cost of this? And it was the relationships that a third left. And people were still, people were weeping, at that moment of the sadness of those relationships that were gone.
Right.
And Linda Peebles, Don Peebles, said we would still do it all over again. And I was like, oh my God, who are these people? Like, who are these people?
We figured out that we were going back into that building. That was going to be in the right size space. We bought the garden space in the back and added that to the space that we had. And then we got back in there, and I remember sitting there with a friend of mine, Don Peebles, who was one of our members that walked through this process with us. And we looked at each other, and Don said, I never imagined.
Their ability to hold so much grief and loss and faithfulness, and it's just, they held, sometimes we think we can only hold one thing, one idea, one thought. It's either yes or no. Like, their ability to hold that in between was really incredible.
And the way I feel about it now is that we have learned precisely what you said. We have learned and sort of had it beaten into us, really, through that process, that we need to walk by faith, not by sight. And we need to trust. And we need not to think up all these big ideas about things that we think are the right things to do, but just listen and be led. And I'm just very pleased, because I think that really characterizes the congregation and the sort of the direction that we're taking right now.
This covenantal democratic process didn't just transform a church building into affordable housing for a lot of people. The process also transformed the people involved in it. Susan and John said that this public process caused the greatest personal transformation they've ever experienced. And they're not alone.
Well, in the process, I can speak personally for me, was the most spiritually transforming thing that I've experienced in my life.
Same.
Wow.
Yeah.
If nothing else happened, that would have happened. Right. If none of it had succeeded and we didn't go anywhere, it was for all the people that were part of, especially the vision team, it was a spiritually fundamentally transformative process for us.
I would actually say that too, that is what the development team that I worked with would say of that experience with us. Our project manager, Jill Norcross, and then Nina Janopol and Carmen Romero and Laura London. That was the development team. And they said they were spiritually transformed through this work, even though they were on the development side. That their growth is spiritually. They've told me that. It's like this was one of the most deepening spiritual experiences.
I think when we think of
life.
we think of personal transformation, we immediately think of, my first thought is, getting alone and quiet, which is there's certainly a place for that. But it sounds like these transformations that people experienced were in the context of a communal transformation.
Absolutely.
And yet it was the most powerful personal transformation you both say you've had.
Right. And strengthened because it was in community. right? I'm convinced that is what Jesus was talking about all along.
Thank you for listening to Public Spaces. Join us next month when we'll hear a follow-up to this episode. We'll learn how the COVID epidemic, horrible as it was, introduced Arlington Presbyterian to why they were in Gilliam Place, the new affordable housing building that their church building was raised to make way for. We'll discover how they discovered many gifts among themselves and how those gifts would help out their new neighbors. Until then.